They wrote her name between the silver service and the wine cellar. That is the detail she would remember years later, when people asked her what it had felt like to read it. Not the inventory number assigned to her, not the valuation. 4 years of labor priced below a decent riding horse. The detail she remembered was the placement. Someone in that house had sat down with a pen and a ledger and made a decision about where a person belonged in the order of things, and they had decided, after the Wedgwood, before the 1847 Bordeaux. She had been standing at the back of the great hall with a tray no one had asked her to carry, the way she had learned to stand in rooms where important things happened, useful enough to justify her presence, invisible enough to be forgotten. She had learned that in the first month at Colburne Hall, a woman with a tray in her hands becomes part of the furniture. A woman without one gets sent away. She had been Nell here for 4 years. Nell the housemaid, quiet and quick, with the kind of face that people look at and immediately forget. She had chosen that face deliberately. She had chosen the gray dress and the plain cap and the careful way of moving through a room that takes up no space and makes no claim. Her real name was Daphne Colburne. Colburne Hall had been her father's house, and now, on a gray October morning with rain against the long windows, it was being inventoried for sale by a man who had no right to sell it. Her uncle, Clement Colburne, stood near the fireplace. He had the same quality her father had lacked, the ability to look completely at ease while everything collapsed around him. He watched the solicitors move through the hall with their folders and their quiet voices, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he believes he has already won. She watched him the way she had watched him for 4 years, from behind the tray, from the corner of the eye. She had learned his face the way you learn a landscape you live inside. She knew when he was genuinely pleased and when he was performing pleasure, and right now he was performing it, which meant something was making him uneasy underneath. The buyer had arrived. She had felt his arrival before she saw him. Something in the house changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way grand entrances announce themselves, quieter than that. The solicitors straightened almost imperceptibly. Her uncle's smile tightened at the corners by exactly the amount a smile tightens when a man appears who cannot be easily read. Alistair Verne came through the front doors of Colburne Hall without looking up at the ceiling the way visitors always did, because the ceiling was extraordinary and everyone always looked. He did not look at the portraits or the staircase or the long windows that caught the light on clear days in a way that made the whole hall look like it was made of amber. He looked at the floor. He crossed the room with the careful attention of a man who is counting something no one else can see. And he stopped at the long table where the inventory had been laid out for his inspection, and he picked it up. He read it the way she had learned to read documents in this house, carefully from the beginning, not skimming for the parts that mattered to him, but going through it as though every line deserved the same weight. Her uncle had started talking almost immediately, the smooth narration of a man who had rehearsed this, the quality of the stonework, the productive farmland, the cellars, the staff. Verne did not appear to hear him. He read the way you read when you are looking for something specific and have not yet decided whether you have found it. She watched his hands on the paper, steady hands, ink-stained at the right forefinger, the way a man's hands go when he writes a great deal himself rather than dictating to a secretary. He reached the middle of the inventory. He went on reading. Her uncle had shifted topics to the library collection, which was genuinely impressive, and the solicitors were making notes. And the whole room had settled into the rhythm of a transaction about to be completed. Then Verne stopped. She saw it from across the room, the stillness of a man who has just read something he did not expect to find. He read it again. She counted 3 seconds. Then he read it a second time and she knew. She knew the way you know when you have spent 4 years waiting for something, and suddenly the room rearranges itself around the moment. She knew he had reached her name. He set the inventory down on the table. He looked up once, his eyes moving across the room in the unhurried way of a man taking stock of a different kind, past the solicitors, past the 2 footmen near the door, past her uncle still speaking about the library, until they came to rest on the woman in the gray dress, standing against the far wall with an empty tray. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. 3. She did not look away, though every year in this house told her to, though everything she had learned about surviving inside other people's spaces said that a woman with a tray does not hold the gaze of the man who has come to buy the house. She held it. Something passed through his expression. She could not name it. Then he spoke, and his voice was level and unhurried, and it reached every corner of the room. "I'll want the household ledger. Every account entry for the past 4 years. Her uncle paused mid-sentence. "The ledger? Of course, though I'm not certain what bearing the domestic accounts have on." "Bring it," Verne said in exactly the same tone. Not impatient, not sharp. Simply the voice of a man who has made a request and expects it to be met. No one in the room understood yet what he was looking for. Daphne did. She had been the one who put it there. She had known the night she first arrived at Colburne Hall as Nell the housemaid. Cap pulled down, reference letters forged well enough to pass a distracted housekeeper's inspection. She had known that she could not walk into a solicitor's office and claim her inheritance with nothing but her word. She was 22 years old. Her father had been dead for 6 months. The will Clement had presented to the court contained an addendum in her father's hand, or what a court had accepted as her father's hand, that transferred the estate to Clement in the event that Daphne had not married by the age of 30. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie because she had watched her father write his actual will. She knew the pen he used, the way he blotted the nib before each new line, the particular slant of his letters when he was writing something he considered important. The addendum had none of those things. But knowing something and proving it are not the same country. What she had was one fact that no one else living knew. Before he died, her father had written a second document, a codicil, and hidden it inside the house. He had told her where. He had not told anyone else. She could not get to it from the outside. The house was occupied, and Clement was not a man who received unexpected guests. So she had gone in through the servant's entrance, and she had spent 4 years learning the geography of a house she had grown up in, finding the right moment, and waiting. She had not found the moment, not alone. She had understood, somewhere in the 3rd year, that a woman with no money, no allies, and no legal standing cannot fight a forged document by herself. She had been waiting for someone who might be worth trusting, without knowing who that person might be, or whether they would ever come. Then the estate had gone into debt. Clement had managed that, she thought, by the time-honored method of spending what belonged to someone else, and a buyer had been found. On her first night in the house, 4 years ago, before she had learned that the housekeeper slept lightly, and the kitchen floorboards announced, "Your wait at the 3rd plank from the left," she had done one careful thing. She had taken a single page from her own small supply of paper. She had written on it her true name, the date, and a precise description of what her father had told her, where the codicil was hidden, and what it contained. She had folded it twice and slid it inside the spine binding of the household accounts ledger, behind the front board, where the leather had begun to separate from age. She had not written it as proof. She had no illusion that a piece of paper in a servant's hand would constitute proof. She had written it because she was 22 years old and frightened and needed one true thing recorded somewhere, even if only the house itself could read it. She had never once imagined that the man who found it would be a stranger who had come to buy the house. The household ledger was brought. Verne took it from the solicitor's assistant, set it on the table apart from the inventory, and opened it. He was systematic about it, going from the beginning, and the room settled into a new kind of waiting. Her uncle had stopped talking. That was the thing she noticed. Clement was not a man who ran out of things to say. He had spent his adult life filling silences with words that cost nothing and committed him to nothing. But he stood by the fireplace now with his mouth closed and his eyes on the ledger, and Daphne thought, "He doesn't know what's in there." He never looked. Why would he look at 4 years of domestic accounts? Verne turned pages with the same methodical care he had given the inventory. Once he paused over an entry, she could not see which, and ran a finger down the column without comment and went on. He was near the back of the ledger. She watched him reach the point where the binding had been repaired badly 3 years ago. The point where the front board had been re-glued with what smelled like ordinary flour paste, and had never sat properly flush with the cover since. He stopped. He turned the ledger slightly in the light. He felt along the spine with one thumb. Then he looked up, not at her uncle, not at the solicitors, at her. She had been standing against the same wall for 20 minutes. She had not moved. "Miss," he said, and the whole room turned, because he was speaking to a servant. "Would you wait outside, please? I'll need a word with you directly." Her uncle straightened. "Whatever you wish to know about the domestic staff." "Thank you," Verne said pleasantly. "I'll speak with her directly." She waited in the corridor. When the door opened and he stepped out alone, she was composed. She had spent 4 years composing herself in this house. He stopped a yard away and studied her with the same measuring attention he had given the inventory. "Your name," he said. "Nell, sir, Nell Marsh." The false name came easily. It always did. "Your name," he said again quietly. "Not an accusation, a patience." She looked at him for a long moment. He was perhaps 35. The tiredness around his eyes was the specific kind that comes from sustained concentration over a long time, not from one bad night. There was nothing cruel in his face, and there was nothing easy in it either. It was the face of a man who had been careful for a long time and knew the cost of it. "Daphne Colburne," she said. Something moved in his expression. He had known, she realized. Not certainly, but enough. Something in the ledger, or something in her face, or the combination of both. "How long have you been in this house?" 4 years. "And before that?" "I grew up here. My father was Robert Colburne. This was his house. He died 6 years ago. His brother presented a will that gave the estate to him, and I had nothing to counter it with except the knowledge that my father hid a codicil somewhere in this house before he died. I couldn't get to it from the outside, so I came in." She watched him take this in. He was very still. "The page in the ledger," he said. "I put it there the first night. It names where the codicil is. I couldn't retrieve it myself, phone. It's in the study, behind the east wall panel, and the study has been locked since Clement moved in. He uses it as his own. I have never once been alone in that room." She said it flatly, because the flat version was the truth. The version with her feelings in it was not something she intended to offer a stranger. "I came here to buy an estate," Verne said after a moment. "I also came because Clement Colburne's name appears in 3 years of correspondence related to a railway fraud that cost a man I respected his life's work, and very nearly cost me mine." He looked at her steadily. "I was looking for documents in this house. I had not expected to find a person." She said nothing. "The codicil," he said. "If I get you into the study, can you find it?" "Yes," she said, without any difficulty. He got her into the study. She did not ask how. She heard her uncle being drawn into a conversation about the eastern farmland and the fence repairs needed before winter, heard the whole party moving toward the back windows, and then Verne was at the study door with a key, and she walked into her father's study for the first time in 6 years. She found the panel in 4 minutes. The codicil was there, exactly where her father had told her, inside an oilskin folder tucked into a hollow behind the wainscoting. It was intact. It was witnessed. It was dated 6 weeks before her father's death, and it was quite clear, in a hand she would have known in any light. The estate passed to his daughter Daphne in its entirety, and any addendum appearing to contradict this document was to be considered fraudulent. She stood in the study with the folder in her hands and felt nothing for a moment. Then she felt everything, all at once, and she put her hand flat on her father's desk and breathed until it settled. Verne stood in the doorway watching her, and he did not say anything, which was the right thing. "This is enough," she said, when she could speak normally. "Between this and the page in the ledger, this is enough." "It would be," he said, "under ordinary circumstances." The way he said it told her what was coming before the words did. Clement, it turned out, had not been entirely unprepared. He had not known about the codicil. She believed that, because if he had known, he would have found a way to destroy it. But he had known for some time that his position was less secure than he preferred, and men in insecure positions make arrangements. His lawyers were better than the ones available in the village. His letters of reference for the forged addendum were signed by a magistrate who owed him favors, and when Verne brought the codicil to the table in the great hall and set it down beside the inventory, Clement looked at it for 3 seconds and then smiled. "Force," he said pleasantly. "A young woman who has been in this house under a false identity for 4 years, coached and positioned by interests opposed to the legitimate transfer of this estate." He looked at Verne. "With respect, sir, you have been deceived. I'd urge you not to embarrass yourself further by presenting that document to a court." The solicitors exchanged looks. Daphne saw the looks and understood them. A notarized document produced from a locked room by a housemaid was not, in the eyes of the law, a simple matter. Clement was already moving. His own solicitor had a letter prepared. She saw it produced from a leather case as though it had been waiting there all morning, which it had been. The letter questioned the mental stability of the late Robert Colburne in his final weeks. It carried a physician's signature. The physician was not listed anywhere as her father's doctor, but the signature was dated, and dated documents carry weight. "You've had a long time to build this," Verne said, reading the letter without expression. "I've had time to protect a legal inheritance from exactly this kind of opportunistic claim," Clement said. "The girl is nobody, whatever she's told you. She has no standing, no money, and no corroboration that doesn't come from a piece of paper she produced herself from a room she had no right to enter." Verne set the letter down. He was quiet for a moment, the way he had been quiet when he read the inventory. That specific quality of stillness that was not hesitation, but was something more like the precise moment before a man says what he has decided. "There is one document," Verne said, "that predates your letter. That predates your solicitor's preparation. That predates, in fact, everything your people have assembled this morning." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and drew out the inventory. The same inventory he had read in this room 2 hours ago, folded once since then, carried against him the whole time. He opened it on the table. "When I read this list this morning," he said, "I made a notation in the margin, before I spoke to anyone, before I asked for the ledger, before I knew anything of codicils or hidden panels or 4 years of a woman living inside her own house as a servant." He smoothed the paper flat. I wrote what I write on every document presented to me for purchase that contains an item I refuse to acknowledge as an item." He turned the inventory so the solicitors could read the margin. It was in his hand, firm and unhurried, exactly as a man writes when he is writing something he considers important. "The individual listed below among the property of this estate is recorded here in error. No person may be transferred as property. This party is taken as a protected witness pending the resolution of any contested claim against the estate of R. Colburne. I do not purchase persons. A. Verne." He had written it before he spoke to her, before he got her into the study, before the codicil was in anyone's hands. He had read her name at the bottom of an inventory that placed her between silver and wine, and he had written a declaration in the margin before he took any other action, because whatever else he hadn't known yet, he had known that. The solicitors read it. The room was very quiet. "That notation," Verne said, "is witnessed by everyone present from this morning. It is part of the inventory document your client's own solicitor brought to this transaction. It establishes, before any counter-argument was assembled, before your letter with its convenient physician's signature, before any claim of forgery, it establishes that the woman you are calling nobody was, as of this morning, a protected party with a contested claim. Not property. Not a housemaid to be transferred with the wine and the silver. A person with a claim that requires a court's attention." He looked at Clement. "You need her to have no standing. That was the whole architecture of what you built. She must be nothing. A fraud, a servant, so that no court will hear her. But this morning, in front of witnesses, before I knew the half of what I know now, I recorded that she is something, that the question of what she is must be settled by a court, not by an inventory." He paused. "Your letter cannot predate that. Nothing you have prepared can predate that. The document is already filed with my solicitor as part of this transaction." Clement's smile remained, but she had spent 4 years reading Clement Colburne's face, and she saw what was under the smile now. It was not composure. It was the particular expression of a man who has just understood that the floor beneath him has been different from what he believed it to be, and for longer than he knew. The court took 3 months. There were documents she had not known about, and documents Verne's people found in Clement's own records. Payments made to the physician, who signed the letter, correspondence with the magistrate whose name appeared on the forged addendum. Clement had been careful. He had not been careful enough, because careful men who believe they are the cleverest person in any arrangement tend to document their cleverness in ways they think no one will ever read. The codicil held. The handwriting was confirmed by 2 independent experts. The hidden panel in the study was examined and found to contain evidence of previous unsuccessful searching. Someone had been there before Daphne, looking for exactly the same thing, and had missed it by 3 inches. One more thread in the end. Verne's railway fraud case resolved alongside everything else, because Clement's financial records contained precisely what Verne had come looking for, folded into the same mess of falsified accounts that had funded 4 comfortable years at someone else's expense. Daphne Colburne moved out of the attic and into her father's house on a Tuesday in January, which was not a dramatic day and was not meant to be. She walked through the rooms she had been cleaning for 4 years, and they were the same rooms, and entirely different, the way a place becomes different when you stop being hidden in it. Joan, the cook who had called her Nell for 4 years and asked no questions that Daphne hadn't answered, was given a full explanation and a significant raise and stayed on. She was the one who said, 3 weeks later, stirring something on the stove that smelled of thyme and brown butter without looking up, "I knew you held yourself different from the others. Not proud, just, like a person who knows what they're owed, even when they're pretending otherwise. "I wasn't always very good at pretending," Daphne said. "You were good enough to last 4 years," Joan said. "That's not nothing." It was not nothing. She had come to understand that. The 4 years had cost her things she was still counting, but they had also given her something she would not have had otherwise: the knowledge that she could survive inside her own life, in the worst version of it, and still be recognizably herself. A person who has lived that way does not take a house for granted. Verne came back in the spring. He had written twice, formally and briefly, on matters related to the concluded legal proceedings. She had replied in kind. When he appeared at the door in April, with rain still on his coat, and an expression that suggested he had rehearsed several different ways to explain his presence, and discarded all of them, she said simply, "Come in," and brought him into the study, her study now, the panel in the east wall closed and perfectly ordinary, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular, which was the most natural conversation she had had in 4 years. He came back in May and in June. By July he had stopped explaining why he had come, and she had stopped expecting an explanation. He was not, she learned, a simple man. He was precise and sometimes difficult, and held opinions with the stubbornness of someone who had been forced to think things through alone for a long time. He was also, she found, the kind of person who read documents all the way to the bottom, who noticed what was written in the margins, who stopped over details that other people considered beneath their attention. She had spent 4 years invisible inside her own home, waiting for someone to look in the right direction. She thought it said something about the particular person he was, that, when he finally looked, he had written down what he saw before he knew what use it would be. They married in the autumn, quietly, in the church in the village where her father had been buried. Joan fussed over her hair and said very little, which was how Joan expressed the things she felt most strongly. The inventory hung framed in the hall. Daphne had wanted it destroyed at first. Verne had asked her to keep it, for the same reason you keep the record of a thing that almost buried you, so you remember that it didn't. She would show it to visitors sometimes, when they asked about the house, about the years. They always read the line that had listed her, between the silver and the wine, and their faces went tight with the particular expression people make when they encounter evidence of an old injustice. And then they read the notation in the margin, in his firm and unhurried hand, and something in their faces changed. On the writing desk beside the study window, she kept the pen, not the one used to sign the final court documents. That felt too ceremonial, too aware of its own significance. The one she kept was the pen she had found on the hall table. The first morning she moved back into the house as its owner, sitting there as though someone had set it down in the middle of a thought, and simply walked away. She did not know whether Verne had left it intentionally. She had never asked. It suited her not to ask. It was an ordinary pen with a worn nib and an ink stain at the forefinger grip that told you it had been used by the same hand a great deal. She kept it on the desk and looked at it sometimes, on evenings when the light fell long through the study window and the house was quiet. And she thought about an October morning and a man who read a list all the way to the bottom, past the silver, past the wine, past the place where someone had decided a person belonged, and who had, before he said a word to anyone, picked up a pen and refused.